Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
Good evening. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio once again with The Late Show with John B, who will be joining us imminently. It's still time for me to say a welcome if you're listening back to this. It's great that you've chosen to spend a little bit of time with us wherever you are or whatever time it is that you're listening back. This show is brought to you in association with two amazing companies. The first one is the Happy Confident Company. You can find out more about them by going back to our listen back page on the website, and you can find out more on the show that we did last Thursday that was myself and Poppy Gibson. It's available on all good podcast platforms, and it's called 10 Minutes Wellbeing a Day, which sounds like it's perhaps a little bit, what would you say, a little bit of a catchphrase, but it's not. Trust me, if you go back to the website and have a listen back to it, it's a really good conversation about all things well-being. So that's the Happy Confident Company. And also we are sponsored by Pearson, and you'll be finding out more about them later on in this show. So I'm now going to pass over to John.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Late Show with John B. It's wonderful to be back after a short hiatus. I am delighted tonight that I can introduce a very special guest, someone who I spoke to just last week, actually, as a kind of prelude to our conversation this evening. And it's a bit of a varied one tonight. We're going to be talking about what it means to be an anti-racist educator, mental health and well-being in schools. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed processes, behaviour management, and we're going to throw in a little bit of mathematics for good measure as well. So a really sort of packed show full of different things that'll have something for everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my special guest, who will introduce themselves. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Manal Siddiqui, and I'm going to go into my 30th year of teaching. Actually, I started in 1994 in the primary sector, so I was teaching for 9 years in a primary school, and then I'm now in my 20th year within the higher education sector in initial teacher education, and primary maths is my main role, but I also teach on professional studies. And if we get past the first item, we'll be lucky. There's a lot to talk about.
Thank you. Welcome, Manaz. It's lovely to speak with you tonight. Just before we get going then, just to kind of ease us into our discussion and conversation tonight, I started a few weeks back talking about how we might well, I'm sure listeners are familiar with a podcast called Desert Island Discs. This is a little section I like to call Desert Island Desks. So my first question to you, Manaz, is what 3 teaching things would you take with you to a desert island?
Okay. Well, I only saw this later on, actually, when I was looking at the questions that we thought we'd discuss today. And I do like to think differently, so I'm afraid it might not be quite what you're after here.
Okay.
But if I was on a desert island, I think my survival was important, to be able to go on to teach anything. So I've looked at it in that sort of perspective, and I did do forest school training. I tried to keep that quiet, just in case anyone asked me to do more, a few years ago. So I'd want to take tools that would include a knife, but I've got a purpose for that as well. Tarpaulin and something to make a fire. I don't know if these are the sort of things you're after.
Okay.
Okay,
So
the tools can actually be used as equipment to make resources anyway. So being a maths person, I wouldn't want to take anything like Dean's equipment or Numicon, or when I can make my own counting resources from natural resources, if that makes sense.
okay.
Yeah. So do you see what I mean? So I wouldn't want to take plastic things with me when I've got natural resources around me, and they would be multi-purpose as well, because I'd want to be hunting, obviously, hunter-gatherer in me. I'd want to be able to survive as well on this island. Am I looking at this in a different way than maybe you thought I should be answering it, or is it? I'll carry on anyway. The
Yeah,
tarpaulins for shelter, and clearly, I'd like something to make fire, because I think that's really important as well. If you're on an island, I did also want fresh water, but I thought I was pushing it there. If it was to do with resources as well, I know that a lot of teachers want Pritt stick, don't they? That seems to be the big thing on Twitter. But I thought, you see, if you're on a desert island, it depends on what sort of environment you've got. Perhaps tree sap could offer that glue, but what would you need that for anyway? You've got sand, where you can write on sand, you can scratch onto rocks, and if that's a teaching resource. So I think sometimes we can make resources out of what we have, because that happens in some countries around the world anyway. So it's what resources you have, and the best teaching resource is the teacher, really.
I think
don't know.
I think it's a certainly a unique way of answering that question, and a very very literal way of answering it as well. Yeah, just literal survival is what's needed. And thank you. I mean, it's a bit of a ridiculous question to ask, but I think it reveals a little bit about the person that we're talking
I
to.
think it might.
We'll not
I
read
do
too much into
think
that one.
differently than a lot of people.
Just before we begin, then, I'm just going to read out from our sponsor this evening, Pearson EdXL's new student-centered French, German, and Spanish 2024 GCSEs. Caters to all learners, regardless of their background, ability, or reason for studying. It's rooted in learned language knowledge. Their assessments are transparent, accessible, and allow students to showcase their language skills through inclusive and relatable content. The new Pearson MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding and an appreciation of the wider world. And listeners, you can find out more at gopearson.com/MFL. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So, Manas, tonight we're going to be talking about what an anti-racist educator is. So the first question is very straightforward. What does it actually mean to be an anti-racist educator?
Okay, so I think I could spend ages talking about this, and I know we've got other questions to get to today, and it's something that I feel very strongly about.
Sure,
I
take your time.
suppose, yeah, I suppose my identity is important here as well, but I'd hope I'd still have as much passion to be an anti-racist, or as I often say, an anti-prejudiced educator. It's important, and it's a duty of a teacher to not discriminate against any of the protected characteristics, of which race, which we can discuss later, maybe is a social construct anyway, but there is, we're not to discriminate against people because of perceived race. So for me, I think my identity is important. So I have my own perspective on this. As you can tell from my name, Manal Siddiqui, when you see my name in print, you might be wondering what heritage I may be. And so my dad was actually born in India, and he moved to Pakistan in the partitioning. He's very proud to be called Pakistani. And my mum's English and had an Irish father. So I've got a mixed heritage, if that's even the right word to use now, heritage. I've stopped saying mixed race now because of the word race and actually what that means. Because we are a human species. So my identity, I think, is important because I have got lived experience of racism, but that's very specific to who I am. Because often it's when people find out my name rather than when they first see me. Sometimes people don't know until I tell them my name. So that's when I can experience it. So to be an anti-racist educator, first of all, it's a verb, it's an active role. It's important. You might say that I'm not racist, but then that's on a scale of being racist. If you look at what actually being anti-racist is, which is being a very active role. It's taking part actively to address issues where there could be barriers to children and educators regarding achievements, basically. So it's an active role to really know what you have to do to ensure that your curriculum is accessible for all of your children. I suppose you've heard the term decolonising the curriculum as well. So it's that idea of looking at the curriculum. I had to unpick what that actually meant as well for a while, and simply in terms of a teacher really in the classroom, what can you do? Because there's structural racism anyway. In the school, what you can do is look at your curriculum, look at things from not just a Western or Eurocentric viewpoint. And I think it's really important to be an anti-racist educator is knowing the importance of why it's important as well, because there is evidence of achievement within children and barriers that are in place that hinder achievement of certain ethnicities, as the government data classifies it. And to be able to know the importance as well is that impact on society, and the bigger picture of what a good education, an anti-racist education can do for the future, if that makes sense. So I suppose, first of all, you have to identify. It can be quite challenging, really, that everyone, whoever you are, you have to sort of identify and address your own biases that you have and your own stereotypes that you hold. And the biases that can be, you talk about implicit bias later on, but it's that idea of being for or against a person or a group, and that can be developed from your upbringing, from the perceived wisdom that you have, and the beliefs that you grow up with that you think are correct. So, depending on what you've learned early days in your formative years, you have to identify, actually, have I got biases there that I've learned?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear both of you. I'm not sure what's going on there, John, but I can hear you.
Can you hear
My
me?
apologies. It really dipped out there. Sorry about that.
That could be your Wi-Fi, that, John.
Oh.
I have a feeling, because I can hear the guest.
Can you hear me?
Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am rattling on a bit, John. I've got up to the point where I'm talking about it's important to address your own biases and stereotypes and your biases you might have developed over your formative years. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, John, but I think potentially your signal's dipping in and out, because we can hear you and we can hear the guest. Do you want to try rejoining the space and then maybe just making sure you're as close to your router as possible?
Is that John or me?
Not you. John, you're fine, I think. I can hear you loud and I can hear both of you loud and clear, but it just seems like it's dipping in and out. I'll ask you a question while we're waiting for John to return. So you sort of, I've just been listening to the first sort of few minutes. What you mentioned, sort of the barriers in place for. I'm not sure the precise sentence. I can't remember what you said, but it was something along the lines of the barriers in place for students from ethnic minorities to achieve, I think was broadly the phrase. Could you tell us maybe a bit more about those barriers and what they are?
Okay, so if you're in a classroom, you want to feel a sense of belonging. So barriers can actually be that curriculum and curriculum choices. So it's quite important that you really know your class and you know about your families and your communities. So when you are choosing books to read, for example, or you're looking at different foods, you have to really think about your community. I mean, this is me just thinking off the top of my head at what those barriers might be. The barriers can also be sort of very subtle barriers that are part of the bigger structural racism and policies and practices. They can be barriers. And I know we haven't talked about, but the word and the language of institutional racism, is still used, whereby, and that is where, schools do have to look at their policies and practices. They do have to consider, is this fair for all of my students? So if I'm planning an exam, is it landing at the time of Ramadan, for example? So these are sort of barriers that can happen, and that's a bigger picture sometimes. Other barriers.
I think
Sorry.
hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry
Yeah.
about that. And I think it's an interesting point to pick up on. We were just talking about kind of what an anti-racist educator is, and I just want to kind of try and focus your thoughts around this idea of implicit bias and what that could look like in classrooms.
Yeah, so when you say implicit bias, you've got to think of, I suppose, so it might be that children, if you think about children, if they've got an implicit bias, that idea of a certain belief, that's that basically it. I mean, from looking at the definition, it sort of it occurs automatically. It's unintentional, but it can affect the judgment and decisions. And it's not just children who can have those implicit biases about other people, other cultures, other religions. Teachers can have implicit bias too, and that's why it's important that teachers address that. We show our students sometimes videos just to show them how it can happen. And this is when black and white teachers were watching 4 children, and one of the children was a black boy, and they had to look at the behaviour of the children. And when they scanned where the eyes were actually focused on, all of the teachers were mainly focused on the black boy. So already they were looking for certain behaviours from a certain child. So we all have those sort of implicit bias. And I think what we have to do about it is start to really question ourselves and think, what is it that we do? And it can be quite uncomfortable for educators to do that, because it's embedded in how we might think about certain people, certain groups of people, through sometimes what the media shows us, because we know that can be skewed. What we see on television, what we hear, how we've been brought up. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I'm wondering if you've got any sort of advice or resources, or you can signpost people as to how they might go about kind of reflecting on the implicit bias that they have within themselves.
Well, and it is quite tricky, but I do know I was looking at something the other day, and I think it was in one of the books I was reading. I think it's by Samira Chowdhury, or one of the people that I've been reading, and that's called Equitable Education. And she links to, I think it's her book, and if it's not, it might be Aisha Thomas's book. I'll mention everybody in a minute. And it links to a Harvard website, actually, where you can have a look at it's a little test that you do, and it shows you where your biases might be. So if I can find the link to that, I can add it at some point to a Twitter feed or something. But that's quite interesting. The other thing is, I suppose you just have to be very, very conscious. It's we talk about unconscious bias, and that's when you're doing things you don't really know. But then I think what you have to do is start to be consciously biased. So even if it's looking at who do I question in the class, who answers my questions in the class, because, and this is looking at maybe a dominance of boys within a classroom. Do you respond to them? Who do you focus your questions more on? Who do you pick to do certain activities? And I think you've got to consciously observe yourself, really, if that makes sense. That's something that, I'm just thinking of on the top of my head what you have to do. And I think once you start to consciously think about your choices, you might realize how you can make biased choices sometimes. Who do you ask to help you? Who do you ask to take the register back to the office? Who's got the roles and responsibilities in the classroom? Why have you made those choices? Do you see what I mean? So I feel like everybody should have a role in the classroom.
And really kind of that'll require a lot of teachers to do a lot of soul searching, I would have thought, and really question their reasoning and rationale behind perhaps what people might consider as very simple, straightforward decisions that are made, but actually what sits behind those might be, as you say, a little more uncomfortable.
I know, yeah. So it's like sometimes people say, well, they're sensible, they'll be good to do that job, and I think, well, I want to be able to trust this person too. Do you know what I mean? It's always seeing the good in everybody, always find the good in every child.
Sure.
And I think it's important to model that to the children in your class as well, because they look at you and they mirror how you are. Go on. And anyway, I'm going on.
No, it's fine. It's really interesting stuff. You mentioned Manaz, about you mentioned equity, and equity is something that's very kind of close to my heart in education. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how educators might create a more equitable learning environment for all of the students.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's that idea of, and I just asked someone this the other day just to see what they said, and it was a student, not one that I taught, but it's that idea of, I actually said, what do you think it means to be an anti-racist educator? It's my little bit of research, and they actually said treating everybody equally, and I said, oh right, okay, well that's interesting. I said, because if you've seen the little picture by, I think it's Angus Maguire, and he's got 3 children behind a fence. You might know this picture. It's been going wild, hasn't it, on Twitter? And so the idea of equality is that we give everybody the same, but it doesn't actually offer equity. So depending on what your children's needs actually are. So again, it's about knowing your children and what maybe scaffolding they might need to be able to access, in this case, education. In the picture, it's about looking over the fence at a baseball game and being able to see that and be able to be a part of it. But actually, it's about even better if you remove whatever the barrier might be to the learning, whether that be language, for example, or choices of resources, or how you are as a teacher and your expectations and your beliefs. So that could be what you need to do as a teacher, is think about, well, what are the barriers? And it might be more than that. It might be to do with parental engagement even. So there's so many different reasons that there may be barriers. It could be that children are being bullied. And that's a huge barrier. So it's finding out maybe what those things are, and it's quite hard to remove certain barriers, but that's something to be looked at by an educator. So the teaching job is more than just teaching, as we all know. It's you know what, it's so complicated and complex, and I don't think everyone really understands that, do they? When you hear how some people talk about teachers, it's a wonderful job, but as professionals, there's so many complex aspects to it, besides getting that curriculum covered, as it were.
Yeah, some really interesting points there, and I'm sure listeners who are either listening live or at a later time will certainly be able to reflect on some of the things which we've started to talk around tonight. Just a quick word from one of our sponsors then. So this show is brought to you in partnership with the Happy Confident Company, who provide clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programs to help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. Visit happyconfident.com to find out more and enjoy the rest of the podcast. What that now means, we can seamlessly segue into the next kind of item that we were going to talk about today. And I know that it's an item that's equally as close to your heart. And it's around kind of mental health and well-being in schools. And I'm sure lots of listeners will be kind of at the forefront of this in classrooms across the world as teachers and educators and institutions deal with the fallout of COVID and continue to try and support children in many different ways they can. So obviously, from your perspective, my first question is around what do you feel some of the challenges are at the moment that students face in terms of mental health?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I know. I just realised while you were talking that I didn't really mention that there's also this aspect of it's not just about race and intersectionality, and that's something else that I could have talked about there as barriers. Okay, so moving on to talking about mental health, and you mentioned the word students. You see, so
Yeah.
I was thinking, are you talking about students, as in university students? Or you talk about children. I mean, I can talk about children in primary school.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So basically, I'm thinking of the bigger picture here, and I'm just thinking of the world that we're living in at the moment, and actually, the world that children are living in is, dare I say, it's quite a hostile world. That
Mm.
might sound awful, but we're in the middle of a financial crisis. There is poverty, there's hunger. We have children that we know come to school hungry, so that is certainly going to affect mental health, and that's probably related to financial crisis, but also then we have to look at the mental health of our families as well. There's maybe dissatisfaction with how the country's being ruled. Since Brexit actually happened, there's been lots of change in the world. COVID-19, as you said, and even the murder, of George Floyd, that brought about a lot of change.
Mm.
And we were in lockdown at the time, and it was a new sort of like a wave of this activism to restart our, the anti-racist practices that I was just talking about. And it's like, well, how have we changed since Stephen Lawrence? So I felt really quite, I don't know the feeling that I had, but all I know is that our children have been through a lot in the last few years, and that's bound to have had some effect on health and well-being, and socially as well, maybe not mixing in the same way. There was a lot of low-level maybe anxiety throughout COVID. People were actually worried, and there were lots of things that happened to specific families. So I think you've got all of this bigger picture of what's
Mm.
happening. And then I think you have to look at the school level as well, and we have to look at our curriculum and think about how formal it can be very early days for our children, how packed the curriculum is, how our teachers have got a large workload, and hopefully, people are trying to do things about that, and how you manage that, and the expectations of teachers. There's very high expectations of teachers and what they do. And it's not just teaching, as we've sort of looked at here, it's looking after our children's mental health, but of course, looking after their own mental health first, and schools being very aware that we have to look after our teachers. I did a little Google search actually the other day when I was thinking of the happiness of our children.
Mm.
And in comparison to some other countries, the happiest apparently, this is according to a UNICEF research, probably a few years ago now though, but we're in the Netherlands, and it says their happiness is attributed to a non-competitive, low-stress school culture and a good work-life balance for parents, among other reasons. So maybe we can learn a little bit from some other curriculums and cultures. And I know as a initial teacher educator, we often look at, for example, Netherlands or Sweden or Finland for the sort of outdoor learning that takes place there and how important being outside is.
Mm.
And that's why a lot of schools I know look to doing some forest school experiences. And I think that should be for everybody, though. I think it should be for all children. I think we have to look at our curriculum. Is it fit? Is it fit for purpose? Is it fit for our children to develop into the children they need to be for their
Mhm.
future roles? To be, and I know we use the word resilient, but and I'm just wondering how resilient do our children have to be? Actually, can we not support them a little bit better so they don't always have to be as resilient as we think? Just do you know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
we always talk about, yes, we want our children to be resilient. I think they've been pretty resilient over the last few years. I think maybe we need to be kind, and we need to look at our policies and practices in school. And this will lead on to some of the other discussion later about how we manage behaviour in school. What's our expectation? What do we understand by behaviours? Um, Stop over testing. What are we doing? We've got like year
Mhm.
ones doing phonics tests. I
Mhm.
know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's like, oh my gosh, can they not just play? Recently, my son had a half term, and I know that schools are under pressure, and I know that and that's the thing, they're under pressure because of testing and because of league tables and because of other outside inspectors coming in, etc. But in a half term, can they just play? Let's play.
Mm.
They've had that taken away from them through COVID lockdown. So I'd say let them have a holiday, let them play. Yes, education is important, but you've probably heard a lot of the cognitive science that schools are looking at, where they talk about retrieval practice and reviewing and how children learn, and we want the learning to stick. But if we teach an overpacked curriculum, nothing's sticking anywhere, quite
Yeah.
frankly. I can think of places, just I better not say that. But do you see what I mean? We're doing so much and we're moving so quickly through the curriculum, and we've got to do it. And it's like a pressure to finish this. We've got to finish this, otherwise we can't do the next bit. Well, then just take a bit longer. That's what teaching for mastery actually is all about.
Yeah.
It's about having a good pace, isn't it? So that we're not
Yeah.
racing through the curriculum.
I
So
think what you're describing really there is how packed the curriculum is
yeah,
with everything that goes on, all of the accountability, how teachers and children are measured.
yes,
I wonder from your experience and discussions with your students, kind of what would your advice to teachers be who are in the classroom day in, day out to support with their own mental health and
yeah.
the mental health of children? What kind of things can can actually be done in classrooms, perhaps tomorrow or in September, that could really support and really help them?
That, do you know what? This is a really difficult question because it's not a
Mm.
quick fix.
Mhm.
So, it's not like putting a plaster on something, is it? So, mental
Yeah.
health, it's really quite complicated. My dad was actually a psychiatrist, and that's quite interesting. But so I'm quite interested myself because mental health is something that it fluctuates
Mhm.
all day, and something can happen and suddenly there's a dip, and then something else can happen and there could be an improvement. I think first of all, teachers need to be able to manage their own mental health. And with our students, we look at that early days really about how to keep mentally healthy. It's about so what we do is look at healthy I mean, I should be looking at this a little bit more, really. Healthy eating, healthy
Mm.
lifestyle. And this is a difficult conversation to have with year ones coming into into their first year at university. But because we know what that first year could be like, with all the excitement of meeting new peoples and all of the freshers weeks and freshers activities, but it's knowing how to manage yourself, how to try and have a good sort of work-life balance. And we look at that early days. You've got to have some time to yourself. You've got to have a time when you switch off. And that can be really hard to do, especially if you've got an overactive brain. I know I find it very difficult, but yes, I suppose you can look at doing yoga, mindfulness exercises. Again, nature's really important if you like those sort of things, or doing what you find will switch you off from actually work all the time, and knowing that there's got to be a time when you stop. Um, but also, that's not just for the teacher, though, to manage, because that's got to be a whole school ethos as
Yeah.
well. It's all very well saying this, but we hear people talking about toxic work environments. And if that's the expectation, that you're in at 7, you leave at 6, that's not a healthy expectation for anybody.
Mm.
And if that's what schools are expecting, and sometimes um, a teacher might expect someone else to work like them, it might
Hmm.
suit that person, but if it doesn't suit another person, they might want to work at a different time. You should never impose how you want to work on anybody else. So yeah, I think teachers need to find strategies to look after their own well-being, um, because it is really important, so that eating healthily as well as you can, having your own leisure time, having interests, and learning how to switch off can be very, very difficult. Trying to get a good night's sleep is meant to be so, it is so good for you. And exercise, that's what everyone will tell you. That's what your doctor will tell you.
Yeah.
It's hard to
It's
do.
really refreshing to hear someone not say that you put a cake on the staff room table once
Oh,
every term on a Friday, because for some schools it can be quite tokenistic, and I think talking there around kind of a whole school approach, there
yeah,
are things absolutely that schools can do. I agree, but I think what the crux of the matter here is that it's very personal to each
yeah,
individual teacher. And
yeah,
for my well-being, I might like going out for a walk with the dog, but for another teacher, that could be something very different.
yeah,
And I think we schools really ought to have that flexibility
yeah,
if they're thinking, and like you say, not to have every teacher in at 7 o'clock in the morning and
yeah,
leaving at 6 o'clock, because that's a surefire way
yeah.
of leading to burnout.
And I know a lot of schools are doing this now. I know a lot of schools are really addressing their teacher wellbeing. But like any policy that's in place that says we have a teacher wellbeing policy, that's all right being there, the policy, that's great. It's got to be acted out. That's the thing, isn't it? It's all very well, it's in print, but it's got to be acted out, hasn't it? Like an anti-racist policy, like any policy. It's all right, it can be in print, but it's got to be acted out. And of course, I'm speaking as a woman here of a certain age, and people will laugh if I start to mention the menopause, but I'm sorry, it's a real big issue out there. And we know a lot of the teaching profession are females. So please, I would say to people, do look after all of your staff, but it's knowing that certain adjustments may need to be made
Mhm.
for certain staff. And I know that just because you work in a certain way doesn't mean everybody else has to work that way. Even if you send an email on a Friday at 5 o'clock with, "Oh, don't worry about this till Monday," you've still sent it, so don't
Yeah,
send it. Do you see what I mean? Why
yeah,
did you bother sending it then? Send it so that it's set up to go on the Monday, so people
mm,
aren't worrying all weekend. You
absolutely.
know, I've had many an email where I worry, and I've worried unnecessarily about things, and that's because of previous experiences in the workplace. So
Mm.
it can be quite detrimental to your mental health, actually. And
Sure, and I think
yeah,
we don't get it right all of the time, and there's lessons in a lot of what we do, and sometimes just holding your hands up and saying, do you know what, I didn't get it right that time. Apologizing, learning, moving on, reflecting, can be a really powerful way forward.
yeah. I'm really fortunate to have a great team that we work with, and we are like this. We don't get, you know what, we don't get told off. It's brilliant.
Mhm.
You know, yeah, I've heard, people do get told off, don't they, sometimes? And you're an adult.
Yeah, absolutely,
It's like,
absolutely.
what's going on here? So
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm putting on your accent there. Um, sorry, I tend to mimic. So, we were talking about the challenges. So we've got all of that sort of thing going on, and then you started to talk about. I was also thinking with children as well, the challenges. That's the bigger world that we live in, and teachers also have to manage theirs. But then obviously you've got what might then fit into the idea around trauma informed practices as well. Is that the sort of like school, home and family sort of culture and well-being, and what's going on at home with any sort of you know there might be abuse, there might be other domestic violence, for example. You might
Mhm.
have children who are seeking asylum, and so on. So there are other issues that children looked after may have as well, which
Sure. We
which
we
will obviously, yeah,
segued just nicely there into
yeah,
trauma and managing behavior and different approaches.
yeah.
And I wonder if I could just focus the conversation towards kind of our listeners and giving them an understanding of what we mean by trauma-informed approaches in schools.
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie here. This is something that I've wanted to learn more about myself this year. So it's not that I don't know that these things happen, but I kept on hearing people talking about trauma informed practices. And I
Mhm.
thought, oh, I need to find out a little bit more about trauma informed practices as an educator to be able to look at what we do in initial teacher education that's above and beyond some of the behaviour management strategies that you might see. Um, so, so basically, so trauma informed practices basically are. Do you know what? It's about just being very human, but also it's about knowing your children and knowing if they've had any trauma. So it's really important that you know your class, and you know which children are looked after. You might need to know some of the history of what's been going on and why maybe the children have been fostered. It's important to know the children. They might have specific education health plans. Um, it's so it could be. I've got a little list here as well because sometimes I need reminding.
Right?
So it could be children who are no longer living with their birth families for whatever reason. There might have been trauma there. There might have been bereavement. Children may be adopted. So there are issues here of insecure attachments.
Mm.
Um, the idea of maybe, I mentioned about family bereavement, child asylum seekers, refugees. So if you've got children in your class, sometimes I hear the students telling me that they've got some children with English as an additional language, and I say, "Oh, that's very interesting. What can you tell me about the child?" So we don't group all children together, but what can you tell me where they've come from? And if they say a country that I know, for example's had is in the middle of a war, as it's what do you know what experiences they went through? Oh, yes, they've
Mm.
come with their grandparent, or they've left their parents behind. There's all these stories that you hear, or some of them are travelling and they're going to join a family later. And you just think, now, this is really important, isn't it? Because there's going to be trauma there. And with that trauma, it's about that development as well of the brain. So I'm learning here. So
Yeah.
as I talk, I'm sort of trying to explain things, and I'm still learning myself. Um, because how then children develop will um, will have an impact on their behaviours in the
Mm.
classroom.
Mhm.
So as a teacher, you need to be very thoughtful and considerate about how you are behaving and how you set up your classroom so that you're not triggering any sort of trauma responses, if that makes sense, any behaviours. So children kicking out and what we call acting outside, it's sort of like, you might have heard of the window of tolerance. So it's that idea that we've all got a window of tolerance, but if you've had trauma in your life, that might be quite a narrow sort of window. So you can, things that maybe could trigger you can cause you to be hyper arousal. It's called the hyper arousal, where you might fight or flight, or the opposite, which is the hypo arousal, where you might freeze and that sort of depression or block out. And a flop response, even, it can be where it's just the opposite of hyper arousal, basically, and that can be the response of a child. So if you're quite novice, or if you've been teaching for a long time, sometimes you think, oh gosh, what happened there? You know, it could be a response that you were not expecting. And that's why I mentioned in a little conversation earlier about a lot of behaviour systems in school are still behaviourist, where there's rewards and sanctions. And even the very word sanction, I think, is really dated. I think, what are we sanctioning children? We're sanctioning them. And actually, sometimes we're even taking playtime off our children. And it's like, can you imagine if you were a member of staff and someone said, you didn't wash your mug after playtime, so you're going to miss break tomorrow? Can you imagine if we treated adults in the way that we feel that we can treat children? Is that not a power thing? And it makes me always wonder why we would do some of the things. So just putting a name on a board to a child who's experienced trauma, or any child, is humiliating. But it can just take them out of that window of tolerance.
And I think as well, given, I think it's interesting that it affects the brain and the development of children. Are there any kind of specific strategies that educators can use to support children who've experienced trauma?
Yeah, so really it is about thinking as a whole school, really. It's got to be a whole school approach. All stakeholders need to know. They need to know how you're talking to children. It's really important. And I'll tell a true story because I'm not perfect. I'd like to think I was. I'm not perfect, and you do pick up things in your life. I used to be a bit of a pointer. I used to point quite a lot, and that's quite aggressive. Someone said to me. Someone said, "You do know you're pointing." It was one of my head teachers early days. I went, "Oh," as I pointed at him. Am I? I thought, yes, I do that, and I stopped doing it. I thought, no, you're right. That's quite an aggressive sort of body language there. That I will address that, and it's important that I took that on board. I didn't take offence. I thought about it, and I thought, you're not wrong. I've learned a lot about my behaviour and how that would impact on children's behaviour. So it takes for you as an educator to be honest with yourself. And I've had to be honest with myself because I'm quite demonstrative and I can be quite excitable. And not everybody likes that. Some of my students don't like it. But I have to be me as well, but I've realized that sometimes you have to think about how you conduct yourself because you are a role model.
So
It's about showing that if something happens, it doesn't go quite your way, or if it's showing and modeling to children how you might respond. So the EEF has lots of documents, and one of them's about self-regulation and metacognition. I think lots of schools are looking at that now, about how to regulate and how to self-regulate. So looking at strategies for how to look at your own sort of behaviours, and it starts with the teacher. So I think that's important. Teachers need to know actually the effect of trauma on the brain. And I know that Paul Dix did a lot of training early days on behaviour. He talked about and I can't say this, it's the part of the brain that they call the reptilian part of the brain. I always pronounce it incorrectly. Amygdala. I think I said it right that time.
Okay.
And how if a child feels that they're threatened, because if you've experienced trauma, you're sort of in a bit of a survival sort of mode. That part of the brain is triggered, which maybe then won't let me think in a rational way, and I might kick out and I might behave in a certain way. It's a sort of survival response. It's
Mm-hmm.
that it's the fight or flight. You might know you'll know the feeling yourself, I suppose, when there's a huge release of adrenaline sometimes if you feel fear.
Yeah.
And children can be hyper sort of sensitive to that, and it's that part of the brain that can be activated. So if you even if you're looking at a child, think about what your face is saying. I always say to our students that, and it's important, but they might have trauma themselves. But
Yeah,
it's
and I think that kind of links
yeah,
back to what you were saying earlier about kind of the teachers being a mirror and reflecting
yes,
the values, the ethos of the school,
yeah,
and how we respond. And teachers are tired this time of year.
yes, yeah,
How we respond can have a huge impact. So,
yeah.
I guess my next kind of train of thinking is, aside from not pointing at children, what other kind of common behavior management strategies would you say are really useful in the classroom?
Okay, so when we talk about behaviour management, all right, I'll talk about behaviour management now, as in we look at, first of all, we might look at classroom management and what's your classroom looking like.
Hmm.
So for some children, it can be a trauma trigger if you have a very sort of like messy environment.
Mm.
Unfortunately, that was what my class used to look like years ago, but it might seem unsafe to a child who's had trauma because it looks chaotic. If you've been in a country where your house has been destroyed and you've got this chaos around you and this rubble, if your classroom's looking a little bit like that, it's looking very disorganized. That's one thing that could cause trigger. So it's quite nice for some children to know that they're in a safe place, so that
Hmm.
your classroom is a safe place. So it's more than just what it looks like, it's that ethos that all your children, you know all their names, you know what they like, their likes, their dislikes. You have thought about seating plans. Everyone knows where their equipment might be. Everybody's got a pencil. Everybody knows where their pencil are. They know that they can go and get those things if they need to. So I think that's really important, that a teacher, and I know it might sound, teachers are going, yeah, of course, we know that. Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's really important. That's great. And a lot of teachers are doing this, aren't they? And that's already part of what you would call a trauma-informed practice. So I know so many schools now are looking as well at, well, is my classroom really busy? Because some classrooms have got quite a lot of displays around, and is that actually overstimulus for some children, possibly?
Yeah.
So it is thinking about, does it look warm? Does this classroom look warm? I've seen some schools changing even the sort of furniture as well, and having carpeted classrooms, because the scraping of chairs can be quite loud, quite noisy,
Hmm.
and that's for some of your neurodiverse children as well. Will struggle with that
Hmm.
scraping sound of chairs, and you might find children going under the table.
Yeah.
Just to try and get a safe space.
And I
Um,
think what we're really exploring here is about how I think perhaps maybe 20, 30 years ago, teachers might react to behavior.
yes,
This sounds to me a lot more as though this is really some subtle strategies in preventing
yes,
any kind
yeah.
of.
These are
And,
preventative. Yeah. So yeah, you're exactly right. So if you look in some of the literature about behaviour management, it talks about preventative.
mm,
So setting up your classroom, having that sort of organisation, all of these things are preventative. Being knowledgeable as a teacher, having really good subject knowledge, being interesting, listening to your children, letting them have a voice, all of these things, being well prepared, being planned, so that you're not rushing around looking stressed. So if you come in and you're calm, you know what you're doing, and I'm not saying I ever behaved like this, but I got better. You know, sometimes it's hard as well when you're at university and you're about to go in and someone's in the room before you. It can be quite a moment of handover. But in a classroom, when it's your class and you can be ready, it's being ready, and you're ready for the children. And even before they get in the classroom, you'll see lots of schools doing this now. And it's something, no one taught me this, but that meet and greet. I always
Mm.
did it. I always did it with the children, especially on a Monday. I'd see the faces of the children and I'd say, good morning, good morning. And I'd actually say to every single child coming up the stairs.
Mm.
And eventually you'd see a little smile, you know, good morning. And when the child who comes in a little bit later, good morning. Oh, I'm glad you're here. I was wondering where you were. You know, not you're late. You know, it's how you look at children and their behaviour, because whose fault is it if they are late? You know, I'm sorry, but I can't blame a child. You
Yeah,
know,
and usually in primary school, it isn't the child who's at fault. Perhaps it might be different in secondary, but my experience does kind of lie and lean more towards primary. So yeah, some really interesting thoughts there around kind of preventative ways in which to
yeah.
well, prevent behavior from happening. Now, in an ideal world, all of this works, and in all school, children are happy. But if, for example, a child or a group of children, or in fact a class, present as being particularly challenging,
Yeah.
how can teachers deal with that in a way that's effective and respectful, I guess?
Yeah. Okay. So do you know what? Well, do you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking back to my experience, and I had a very, very, very challenging first class. Um, really, really quite challenging. I have to say, I was in year 5, so as a NQT as it was called then, and I had a lot of children who had very specific needs. I didn't have the toolbox as an NQT. I did want to get to know the children. So what I had, my strengths were the forming relationships. So I know that once you've got all this in place, where you've really got to find out who your children are, once you've made good relationships, once you've shown that you're honest, you're authentic, they can trust you, you're already part way there. So to get any really tricky behaviours afterwards, I found that those behaviours didn't happen as much after I had gained those preventative strategies. But
Hmm.
if they were to happen, so for newer teachers, what I do say is going for teachers who are just coming into a class and it's new, and even if you supply, sometimes you do have to have in that little toolkit of it's positive behaviour management anyway. I think that works really well.
Hmm.
It's knowing, you know, I don't think rewards always help. If you've got a relationship with a class, the reward is a smile, and the reward is saying you've really, really impressed me. But if children don't know you, that doesn't work because they don't know you.
Yeah.
You know, so you can use rewards that are tangible rewards. For children, if you're struggling, I would say that you do need to have you might need intervention then from someone higher up within the school to support you if you are struggling, if you're finding things quite challenging in that respect.
Hmm.
That's where you do need to get other support. I've told you I don't really like the word punishment. I said sanction before. I don't like the word sanction, don't like the word punishment. And I was thinking even of the word consequences to action. I think if you've got a child who's experienced trauma, I mean, that's not going to be the way forward either. So maybe intervention is a better word, but you need something different if the children are struggling. And a one size sort of model, as in um, a lot of the rewards and sanctions type of behaviour management strategies don't work for everybody.
Mm.
So I don't know if I've really got a great answer here, but I know that I always use, and I'm not saying you crack jokes wildly at all, but that idea of being authentic, having a sense of humour, and sometimes you don't want to get into any sort of um, argument ever, any sort of with a child, because you're the adult.
Yeah.
So I think it's knowing. I can see that you're, it might be that you can see that the child's tired. I can see that you're, you told me you're a little bit tired this morning. Is there anything I can do for you? It's having those sort of conversations. It's not sending a child out either, because that's also like a form of rejection, especially if they've had trauma in their life.
Sure.
So it's very complicated. What you're asking me there is very complicated, and I think it will depend on your school. It will depend on your relationships with the class. And I'd hope that if you've got very good relationships, you could talk to family as well, and other people within the school, find out how other people deal with things, look at why it might be happening. Is it actually not the child, but it's you? Sometimes you've got to look at yourself and think, what did I do? Did I do something there? Have I caused some distress? Is this work too challenging? Is it frustrating? I need to think about what I've done here. So I often think you have to look at yourself and think, what can I do better?
I think you've hit on something quite interesting there. You've talked around kind of the ethos of a school, the culture of a school, but you've also married that up with some strategies that teachers could use. And I think I was reflecting on some of your responses there, and I think for me, the most effective classes that I've taught or schools that I've taught in have put culture before the strategy rather than strategy before the culture. And the culture of somewhere, if you have a supply teacher in who doesn't know the children, the strength of the relationship of everybody else who works within that school can really support a teacher who is unfamiliar or that kind of thing. So I think you're right. I think the culture there is the key thing of getting right, and that's something that schools will develop over years and years, and can only really be done with very experienced, very knowledgeable staff. And the new staff kind of get taken along with that when they join the school, and that becomes a new culture within the school. And I think it's a really interesting point there.
But it does, John, it
from-
links to everything that we've said earlier, really, about being an anti-racist educator, thinking of trauma-informed practices. If a school's got that culture, an inclusive culture, and that's when you're actually enacting it in everything that everybody does. Everybody's got to be on board with it. It's not just your class teacher, it's your learning support assistants, it's everybody in the school. And it's not easy. It's not easy. And and I'm not saying I was ever perfect myself in school. I had a lot to learn, and I was learning when I could see things happening. I remember children being sent out of the classroom, and one day I saw this little boy, and it was it was around Christmas time, and there was a big Christmas tree out in the hall, and this child had been sent to do lines outside. And this child, I thought, oh, do you know what? This is such a beautiful place for him to be, underneath the Christmas tree with the lights sparkling. And I thought, do you know what? That's a nice little safe place for you. He doesn't care that he's doing lines under the Christmas tree. He's having a great time. And I just thought, what was the purpose of you sending that child there? It's like, why have you done that? What are you doing that for? It's knowing what your children, knowing what the lives are like outside of school, and it's thinking, why would you do that? But actually, he's having a great time anyway.
I think just to sum up for listeners and people who are listening to this in the future, we've so far covered some topics around what it means to be an anti-racist educator, mental health and well-being in schools, and really we've touched on trauma-informed approaches, but through the lens of behaviour management and how that can be done, and strategies and culture that lie behind that. Just for the final kind of 15-20 minutes or so, we're going to touch on a subject that's very close to my heart, and I know it's very close to your heart as well, Manaz, and it's maths. So, nice easy question to start with. What is it that you particularly enjoy about maths?
Do you know, I'm going to find my notes now.
Like changing gear in the car, yeah.
No, there's so much that I enjoy, and you said enjoy about teaching maths, but actually I enjoy learning maths as well. I think to be a really good teacher of mathematics, you've got to really love doing the mathematics. You've got to find it exciting, and you've got to love doing puzzles and wanting to find the answer without someone telling you the answer before you, which is very irritating. So what do I enjoy about teaching mathematics is that it is a challenge actually for a teacher, and I like challenges. I want everybody to love mathematics. I want everyone to be as passionate as I am about it. Because I find that we have a mix of students, some that, and I hate to say this, and I've told them that they're not allowed to ever say it, that they don't like it. And I can't even, it's hard to say that. And I find it, it's like, right, well, we're certainly going to change that. Or I am really good at maths, but I don't like it. Now that worries me. Someone who's really good at maths who doesn't like it. So I'm thinking, what's happened there? So what I do enjoy is that there isn't, a lot of people say I like maths because there's a correct answer, but actually there's not always a correct answer. There can be lots of possibilities, and lots of different ways to get to an answer. Lots of creative thinking that can happen. So that's what I like about maths, and you can have a good discussion about your method of how you work something out. That's the part of maths that I like: problem solving, reasoning, patterns and puzzles. That sort of do they call it non-verbal reasoning?
Yeah.
That type of thing. Yeah.
And how do we go about inspiring the next generation of teachers, ECT student teachers, to be effective maths teachers?
That's a really good question. It's and we have to, part of the requirements are that we have teachers that can motivate our pupils to learn. So to be able to motivate pupils, we need to be motivated teachers of mathematics. So looking at in initial teacher education, we're very aware that a lot of our students, they will have to have qualifications, of course, to a certain level, but they still might have maths anxiety, and their attitudes to mathematics are something that we have to look at, because if they've got those sort of attitudes towards mathematics, it will have an impact on the children. So it's important that we do look at our students' own subject knowledge, and we help them to develop their own subject knowledge, actually, by including that in some of our sessions and showing them different ways of doing things. And explaining to them that, yes, there will have been gaps in their education somewhere that maybe have not been filled in, as it were. So if you try and teach maths and you've had a gap earlier on, you're going to find it hard to progress. And they often talk about teachers that have been a barrier, which is a real shame to hear, really. And I think all teachers would find that upsetting to hear, but that can be the case if you're moving through a curriculum too quickly. And I think some of that, sorry, secondary people, but some of that can happen at secondary. It's very difficult, I suppose, if you've got lots of different primary schools coming up to you with different ways of doing the maths, and then you've got to try and fill all the gaps that might be happening. So I think that's hard with our primary teachers. So we have to start to look at that first. So we do a lot of work around developing subject knowledge, and also teaching them how to teach. So we do a lot of work on number, actually, just to really support the students with how they teach it, but it's also actually teaching them strategies as well, and the importance of knowing your multiplication tables.
Yeah. I'm just going to read out a quick note from our sponsor tonight, Pearson EdXL's new student centres, French, German and Spanish. 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability, or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent, accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills through inclusive and relatable content. The new Pearson MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. And listeners, you can find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL. Manaz, just to try and focus your thinking a little bit further around, we're talking about maths at the moment, talked about what you enjoy, particularly about teaching maths and how we prepare the next generation. But if you were to describe a really great maths lesson, what would that look like?
Okay, no, and that's a really hard question, because yeah, I suppose it depends what you're looking for in that maths lesson. So I'd want to see the children being motivated and engaged. I'd want to see them. You've heard of the 5 big ideas for teaching for mastery. I know you have. So one of them is mathematical thinking. I'd want to see them engaged in mathematical thinking, and that would be possibly through talk and conversations, and allowing them to have that talk and not rushing them through that. Starting off possibly with some sort of problem solving activity, and seeing how they might reason and provide rationale for their answers. I also think it's important that we see children achieving, because we want a can-do attitude in mathematics, I always call it. So we want to see our children achieving. So I think we have to provide them with that sort of experience at the beginning, something where, do you know what, we can all do this, and that will help to develop that little bit of self-efficacy, that confidence at the beginning, so that children would then move on to more challenging problems. And it's, again, we talked about culture, we've talked about it a few times now, but this is a different culture. This is a mathematics culture, where it fits in with all the other sort of culture that we want in our classroom, that our children can make mistakes, that we work together, we're a team, that we trust each other, that we can support each other, that, do you know what, if I make a mistake, that's okay. And I can go, do you know what, I know that's wrong now, but I'm not sure what I've done. And I think a teacher modelling that, modelling thinking, modelling, you can model problem solving, but I'd rather, sometimes people say you teach problem solving. I know we have to teach problem solving sort of strategies, but sometimes if you model a problem before doing another problem, you actually, I don't know if it's a good idea. I think sometimes it's nice to present the problem, see how the children can work on it, and then say, well, this is one way of doing it, this is how I might do it, and showing your thinking. So a great maths lesson is, obviously, the teacher knows where they want to go, it's been well planned. These are some of the things that we talk to our students about, that, what exactly did you want them to learn? How are you going to get there? What are your steps to success? I can talk about all those things, but actually what I'd really want to see is a lot of thinking, a lot of talking, a lot of conversation. And it might be unfinished part 2. Why do we always have to finish things? It might be, do you know what? I want you to go away and think about that. I want someone to come and find out another way of doing it. And I know we've got schemes out there, and I'm not saying anything against those things. They can be very well structured, very well planned, but it's quite nice sometimes to, to try and do sort of like to have your own spin on some of those things as well. I know they're very well considered, the schemes out there. But what I don't see enough of, I think, at the moment is taking the children outside of the classroom, because we talk about teaching for mastery, we talk about seeing maths in different contexts. So it's that idea of maths in a cross-curricular sense as well. So there's quite a few things that, there's so many things. The teacher is your best resource at the end of the day. So it's all about questioning as well. I have to say, the best maths lessons has a teacher that's got really good subject knowledge, that can ask the right questions, that can build on answers, that can clarify misconceptions. And that's the main thing, really.
And interestingly, there, I was just my follow-up question to that was going to be about planning misconceptions in the lessons. I wonder if you had any thoughts around how teachers can do that, and what it might look like, and the reason why teachers might choose to use misconceptions in their lesson.
Yeah, so really for our students as well, if you're a novice, you need to find out what the misconceptions might be, and that's important that our students know that actually at this point in time I'm not sure what they might be. I've got a little bit of an idea because of what we did in our session in mathematics. So for example, when children are counting, they might miss a number, they might count something twice. So looking at very early years, they'll know those sort of misconceptions. When it gets to maybe more tricky maths, they might need to ask the teacher, what could those misconceptions be, and how can I plan for those? Sometimes you're learning on the spot, and you'll find children are doing something and you'll think, oh, they've done this a few times now. So that's spotting a misconception as it's happening. And that's about having the confidence to stop a lesson, isn't it? And look at it. But it's also having the subject knowledge to know it's a misconception too.
Yeah.
I think it's quite tricky, that planning for misconceptions when you're novice, and even when you're after teaching a class for a while, you'll know the sort of mistakes that they might make. And sometimes it's the questions that you ask. It's like, is that question clear? So am I causing the misconception? Or am I teaching a misconception? So it's very
Yeah,
important.
and there's a difference. And I think when, you're right, when used deliberately to reveal the structure of maths, they can be really powerful. But actually, we don't want to teach the children a misconception so that it gets really ingrained. Something that comes to mind, two things come to mind, really. I've seen teachers kind of tell children that when you make a number 10 times big, you add a zero on, which is great for, children in key stage 1. But as soon as they're in key stage 2 and they start working with decimals, that's not always the
Oh
case.
no, it's a real no.
Yeah.
No, I can't. No, you just have to say no. Sorry,
And,
we cannot do that. We're not adding a zero.
and the other one is in actually a room full of adults on why vocabulary in maths matters.
Yeah.
I can recall asking a colleague to tell me the first 4 numbers of their telephone number, their mobile telephone number, which started with something like 0874. But that was kind of how the session had started. I had to draw attention to the fact that O is actually the name of a letter and not a number. And if we're going
Yes,
to
I was
teach
getting worried
children,
then. Yes.
yeah, so around that actually it's a zero, and
Yes.
it's something that I'm very conscious of
Yeah.
if I'm telling someone my telephone number or anything like that. It's always a zero and not a no,
Yes.
because language does actually really matter, and I think that's a common theme through not only what we've spoken about with maths, but actually being an anti-racist educator. Language matters, and how you
Of
phrase
course.
things
Yeah.
absolutely matters. Mental health and well-being in school, the language, the culture that teachers are setting. Again, it comes back to the vocabulary and the language that you're using in school, and trauma-formed approaches as well, and managing the behaviour of children. Again, comes back to the vocabulary, the language which is being used in school.
Sorry, can I just say as well, we've hardly touched on what it means to be an anti-racist educator, and I feel like I've not done that the justice that I could do. I'd need a whole day to talk to you about that. I would like to recommend, though, a very simple book for teachers that is Diversity in Schools by Benny Cara, and I think it's a small book, but it's beautifully written, and it's very accessible. It's spot on. That's been my little go-to, actually. Even though I thought that, oh yes, I'm being an anti-racist educator, I realised that actually you've got a lot to do as well, Manaz. Just because you're called Manaz Siddiqui, you've still got a lot to do, and to think about being the anti-prejudice. It's not having any sort of discriminatory sort of practices. Sorry. And when you talked about zero before, I always remember someone saying to me, when you counted up doing the multiplication tables, mention zero at the beginning, because I think I just jumped into 2, 4, 6.
Yeah,
and it was like such a good point. It was in my lesson notes, but I didn't do it, you know.
Yeah,
So really important that you take advice as well.
absolutely.
You can show that you make mistakes in maths. A great lesson is showing that you can make mistakes too. Yeah.
So important, yeah, so important to make mistakes. And if you have had the opportunity to be in one of my lessons, I'm sure there'll be plenty of mistakes to pick up on. And the children are always very quick to kind of to tell you
Oh yeah.
the mistakes that have been made. Just going back, because you said, Manaz, there about there was a few other things, or a lot more actually, that you wanted to talk around anti-racist education. Is there anything that you would like? We've got maybe a few minutes left before we start and wrap our conversation up. If you anything else that you would like to kind of mention, things that you may have missed that you feel are important, now is your time, and we
Well,
can talk about it.
I mean, there are so many things that I could talk about, really, and I think it's about thinking about why it is so important, really, and looking at the world that we're living in at the moment. Because I mentioned earlier on, when I was a class teacher, a year before I became a class teacher, actually, Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a racially motivated murder, and you will have heard of that.
Hmm.
Incident, you know, it always has a huge impact on me, and it had a huge impact on our, race relations policy was amended, and that happened in 2000. Um, and it was the Macpherson report that did talk about how the police had been institutionally racist. And I do remember at this time a huge sort of reform within education. And this is just quite interesting in itself. I was in my first year as an NQT, and I was made the Equal Opportunities Coordinator. There's a little bit of a laugh there going on in the back of my head, because Manal Siddiqui is the Equal Opportunities Coordinator in her first year of teaching. I was also the RE Coordinator, because, of course, I was going to know about every world religion. I'm saying that a bit sarcastically, as you can tell. But it was interesting for me because I got a lot of training as well at that time. And then 23 years on from that, from 2000, 20 years on from that, you've got the murder of George Floyd, and you've got this sort of wave again of this sort of, this is important in education. And I'm thinking, but how have we moved on? Have we actually moved on? And then you look at the news today, and you look at cricket as a sport, and you think, oh, well, you know what? They're talking about cricket being institutionally, racist, sexist, and what have you. That's in the news. And it's not just that. The police report from Baroness Casey that shows that the police are, this is in her report, isn't it? Institutionally racist. Misogynist comes out in that report, doesn't it? And I'm thinking there's something else that I might be missing out there. But so what I'm saying is, it's really important that as educators, hopefully we can make a difference. I think that's what it's about. And I know I'm talking about an anti-racist curriculum. I'm thinking of all those other protected characteristics where there's a lot of discrimination. So it's really thinking as a teacher, what are the resources that I'm using? Why am I using this book? Is it because it's always been used? Is there another book that I could use that might be better representation for my class? If I'm using Handa's Surprise, for example, it shows me a very limited view of Kenya. What actually does Kenya look like? And if you look at Kenya, images of Kenya, you'll see all of these like high-rise buildings, and that's not the image you get if you look at that book. So it's thinking about your choices. Like we talked about misconceptions in mathematics. Are we teaching misconceptions about other people, about religions, about how cultures may practice their religion, how people might practice their religions? So it's really thinking about that. And actually, let's look at the word race, really, and racism and what it means. It's having tricky conversations with children, and teaching children how to have those conversations. I do like philosophy in the classroom, for communities of inquiry. Philosophy for children, you might have heard of. It gives children a caring way to talk to each other, but it needs to be facilitated, obviously, by a very experienced teacher if you're having some tricky conversations. Some people might dispute that as a method, but I think as a teacher, if you can manage and have some sort of input as well, it's important. And that it's important that a teacher is able to facilitate some tricky conversations as well.
Absolutely.
Do you see where I'm coming from here? So it's about really looking at your curriculum. And as David Olusoga would say, I think I might have said his name wrong. David Olusoga, he talks about Black and British, and you will have seen him on television. He talks about what is actually published out there. We need more publishers from diverse communities. We need to have more books that teachers can go to if they want to look at a different topic in history. Our curriculum has non-statutory recommendations. That doesn't mean we have to do those things, those choices. So I think it's really important that we think of some people might say, yes, but we don't, in our school, we don't have these different communities. Well, even more so that you should be looking at preparing our children to be global citizens.
Sure.
Do you see where I'm coming from now? So those are the sort of things that teachers can do. It's look at what you're doing, think of your choices, and think, why am I doing that? What perspective am I looking at this from? So I was looking at the Aztecs many years ago. I'm talking many years ago, nearly 30 years ago. And even then, as a 23-year-old, I thought, this is a very the view of the Aztecs is making them seem like real aggressive warriors. I thought, I wonder what we were doing around this time. And it wasn't too far away from the time when, Henry VIII was chopping off the head of his wife. So I think if you can sort of make comparisons, how would you feel, children, if someone came to where we are here in Liverpool and they said, this is my country now? How would you feel? And trying to get children to think about things in a different way. So, yeah, I know I've got loads more that I could say as well. But I think I'm tired now as well.
Thank you. I get a real sense of your real passion and flair for this, Manaz, and you've talked really eloquently, and thank you for sharing some of your own thoughts and experiences into topics that are clearly run very deep with you. Thank you for all of our listeners for joining us on the Late Show tonight. And thank you to my very special guest, Manaz Siddiqui. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Take care.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.